Hello everyone. In this video I kind of wanted to talk about or bring out more of what I was saying when I said that companies have become social clubs as opposed to actual businesses. And for that, before I really start talking, I want to try to go through a bit of history for everyone. From 1928 up to 1945, the silent generation would be born, most of whom would have been old enough by their oldest to eventually wind up fighting in the Second World War, the Korean conflict, and Vietnam. In 1946 to 1958 would be when the boomer generation would start being born, meaning that by the time that the oldest of the boomers would have managed to get out of high school would have been around 1964 or 1966. During the closing time periods of both the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. It's very interesting when you consider that, and their youngest would have been graduating in about 1970s, 1976, 1977. They would have to work their way up the ladder. They would have to gain jobs most likely given to them by the silent generation, who gave jobs to help their war buddies. Men and women who had seen 3 wars in the span of their entire generation, who were literally 10 years old during the Great Depression of the United States and the world over, who had watched their elder siblings go off to the Second World War and potentially never come back. There is a reason why the silent generation is so respected and regarded. No other generation since then has had to face so many conflicts in such a short time, and few other generations have managed to accomplish so much. From fighting for civil rights and putting a man on the moon to many, many more things. Meanwhile, unfortunately, their children did not learn to pass the torch as it was taught to them by their parents, or at least what they tried to teach them. You see, by the time that the baby boomers started actually taking control of corporations in the 80s and 90s, we started to see a creeping villainous thought process. An idea where businesses were starting to become less actual business and more along the lines of social clubs. As boomers began to make their way into management positions, 2 things were happening. The rest of Europe finally reconstructed out of the ashes of the Second World War, and with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991, would begin pulling back their manufacturing from the United States and returning it home. Spain, France, Germany, many of the same former Soviet countries whose patriots had tried to restore themselves back to the United States and hiding away from the Soviet Union, returning home. This meant that a large number of factories would be shut down. Jobs would be lost during the 80s and 90s, and with many trade agreements going around the world, it became cheaper to actually manufacture things in off-country sites. The boomers would begin manufacturing chips and computers and electronics more close to China, Japan, and Korea. This would cost many manufacturing jobs which will never ever return, as these chips and other items continue to be manufactured off-country and internationally. During which time, these same baby boomers, along with Gen X's that managed to sneak their way in before the ladder got kicked down, would proceed to make procedural tactics in order to ensure that they would never, ever be replaced. A lot of these procedural tactics would be to start requiring 10 years worth of work experience to do entry-level jobs. From getting your foot in the door and trying to be a janitor to doing the mailroom or just doing any kind of foot indoor job, which used to be as easy as simply applying and having your parents being possibly war buddies, to not even being about whether you could do the job or not. In fact, we have seen just in the past 30 years, businesses no longer being about whether you can do the job, but more about who you know. Even at the ground floor of some of the most basic retail jobs in the country. It's reasonable, of course, to ask for something like 10 to 15 years for something like a management position, but when we're seeing signs for line cooks to be 10 to 15 years experience, dishwashers to be 10 to 15 years experience, hell, I'm surprised these days that we're not at a point in our time period where it requires 10 to 15 years of experience to flip burgers at McDonald's. It's gotten that bad. It is entirely difficult for college graduates to be able to even get jobs in the fields that they have degrees in. And that's not just in liberal arts, that's literally in STEM fields as well. People that have engineering degrees, architectural degrees, degrees in nursing, medicine, cannot find work because all of the entry-level jobs for these industries are all demanding 10 to 15 years worth of experience. You see, 30 years ago, when you got hired at a job, the idea was that you would start at the bottom and then work your way up. This really started out by you showing at the bottom level that you could show up on time, that you were reliable, that you could do your job. By doing so, the boss would actually then take you from your position and try to shuffle you around, get you to learn other positions so that eventually they could find a fit for you. When you proved that you were capable of that fit, they would then promote you to that level. They would then provide you an increase in pay. And you would go higher and higher in the department as you grew in skill. Today, you're lucky if you can even get a janitor's job in some of these businesses. It's ironic that a lot of these times that we're now seeing a good bit of baby boomers and some of these Gen X's literally complaining about millennials circumventing their system. A lot of the major complaints in social media today is literally the fact that now some goofball millennial in their basement with a camera can actually outperform major Hollywood studios, producing massive audience numbers and creating content that people actually want to see for very little cash, which is a major slap in the face to most studio companies and media businesses in general. And you see it not only in that, but you also see it in independent comics. Millennial comic writers are circumventing the comic system and actually publishing their own comics and making millions of dollars doing it, much to the chagrin of the very established and very system and dogma-prone corporations such as Marvel and DC. Today, we see a lot of people trying to blame DEI. And while DEI does have some effect in modern-day businesses, that's for sure, the idea of corporations being social clubs is not a new one. For decades before the DEI mandates started happening, we already had corporations demanding, as I've said, 10 to 15 years for entry-level positions. Interns were being not paid, even though technically, according to the Board of Labor, the only reason an intern should not be getting paid or not be an actual employee is if it's for educational purposes only. Meaning that if your intern's only job is getting you coffee and doing things that should actually be part of an actual employee's job, then it's actually illegal for you to do that. But it's not enforced. In fact, it seems that we have an entire generation, oddly enough, that has made it a point to turn not only business into social clubs, but also investing, also literally everything. It's actually amusing, in fact, due to the fact of some of the ways they run their businesses. Some baby boomers, such as Mitt Romney and others, have figured out that by investing large sums in companies and then loading the board with their buddies, that they can literally drive the business into the ground, all the while feigning ignorance to the shareholders. Thereby, then, as well as their friends and hedge funds, will then swoop in, short the company, earning a ton of money, making money for everybody but the shareholders and the employees. Meanwhile, they continually go to the next company and do exactly the same thing. Businesses are also being run in such a manner in which companies are borrowing massive amounts of debt with no real way to pay them back. Which is in part why we see a lot of these companies, despite having record high profits, crying like they're not making enough. Because you have companies that are worth $60 billion that owe $50 billion in pure and utter debt. And keep in mind, when we're talking about a company's worth, we're not talking about liquid cash. We're talking about what the company is worth as a total. It means what the company actually owns, their IPs, their buildings, their equipment, so on and so forth. These are things that are not necessarily easily liquidated. But these companies are borrowing huge amounts of money in order to expand faster than they should. Not all companies are doing this, surprisingly enough. There's a handful that don't. But the problem isn't a matter of DEI. It's a matter of who's still in charge. As the silent generation aged out and were no longer the CEOs that could kind of curb a bit of the boomerish behavior, we've seen this get magnified even worse and more hilarious, as the boomers that did this are hilariously trying to take credit for things the silent generation did, while laying all of the blame onto my generation, the millennial generation. And being one of the oldest members of the generation of millennials, I can tell you we're 33 years old and we don't run jack. Most millennials are not in management positions. Most millennials do not have the ability to make management choices. When the average age in Congress is 65 years old, millennials are not the ones making the laws. When your president is 70, 80 years old, millennials are not the ones in the executive branch. We're not the ones in the judicial branches. We're not your city councils. We're not your state senates. Maybe it's some time for a little bit of reflection. If times are hard and rough now, it is because the baby boomers who created and turned businesses into social clubs. It is because of the baby boomers who decided to turn the political system into a cesspool of insider trading and nonsensical rules built to engage their own profits and their own wealth at the expense of the younger generations. Generations that they would need to actually pay for the retirement of the now aging out boomer generation out of the workforce, who will probably never retire. Because despite being warned several times, they never really prepared for retirement. Social Security is a welfare program. They make no secret of that. That has been told to these people for decades. Yet they refuse to listen. Our choices now, ultimately, is to start trying to retake the stock market. My millennial is taking what little money we have and investing back into the stock market and trying to take back what we can, trying to do what we can where we can. Companies have become social clubs not because of DEI, but because of individuals who refuse to learn to pass the torch. Individuals who have done everything they could to make sure that they could never, ever be replaced, that they could never, ever be removed from positions of power, and who forgot that time waits for no one.